Frost coated the drainage culvert as deputies lifted a tarp and felt the air change, paperwork trembling in gloved hands, radio static hissing, holiday lights blinking from distant farmhouses while evidence markers waited, silent, for a name, a time, and a reason no one wanted to find that winter morning. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. The discovery occurred outside the small Kansas town of Fairview, population barely over 2,000 in 1987, where December settled early and stayed. The victim was identified within hours as Emily Carter, age 22, a local community college student home for the holidays. Her car was later found parked neatly near the courthouse square, keys missing, windshield dusted with snow, Christmas flyers still taped to storefront windows. The scene suggested movement, planning, and an end that had come quietly. Investigators worked under a gray sky that flattened sound and narrowed attention, recording tire impressions before they softened, photographing footprints before sun could erase them, and sealing clothing for transport to the county lab. The initial assessment noted no obvious signs of a struggle in the Culvert area, a detail that would later matter. The body position indicated placement rather than collapse, and the time window pointed toward the evening before, Christmas Eve approaching with the town already half shut down. Emily Carter had grown up on the same roads now blocked by yellow tape. She attended Thanksgiving services at the Methodist Church, worked part-time at a pharmacy on Main Street, and planned to transfer to a university the following fall. Friends described her as reliable and punctual. Police records reflected no history of running away, no substance issues, no volatile relationships noted at the time. The missing person report had been filed late the previous night by her mother when Emily failed to return from work. Snowfall complicated the early search, filling ditches and mooting sounds. Deputies canvassed barns and outbuildings, checked the river access points, and posted flyers at gas stations where men gathered for coffee during harvest season. Local radio interrupted carols with a brief bulletin asking for information. The autopsy conducted 2 days later at the Regional Medical Examiner's office in Topeka focused on establishing cause and manner of death with limited technology available in 1987. The report noted time of death consistent with late evening hours, exposure contributing after death, and findings that suggested restraint without extensive injury. Trace fibers were collected from clothing, and fingernail scrapings were preserved. No sexual assault kit as defined today existed then, but swabs were taken and sealed. Blood alcohol testing was negative. The conclusions were careful, restrained, and left open questions. Investigators understood early that the lack of visible trauma would complicate narrative assumptions and make timelines essential. The timeline reconstruction began with Emily's shift ending at 6:30 p.m. on December 23rd. She was seen locking the pharmacy door and walking to her car. A neighbor later reported seeing her vehicle pull away toward County Road 12, the route she typically used. A cashier at the grocery recalled her buying milk and bread shortly after 7. After that, the record thinned. Phone logs showed no calls placed from her home that night. Her coat was missing when the body was found, suggesting she left her car willingly or under control. Weather records indicated temperatures dropping rapidly after sunset, with wind chills creating urgency for anyone outside. Early suspects included a former boyfriend, coworkers with access to her schedule, and a drifter reported sleeping in a nearby barn. Interviews were conducted methodically, notes typed and filed in manila folders that would later yellow. Alibis were checked against time cards, church activities, and family dinners. Nothing held. The drifter left town and was later cleared through unrelated arrests in another county. The former boyfriend had receipts and witnesses at a Christmas party. Attention turned to geography. The Culvert location sat along a farm road used by locals, not a place a stranger would likely choose without knowledge. Tire tread analysis suggested a light truck common in the area. Hundreds fit that description. Media coverage remained measured. The local paper printed a black and white photograph of Emily taken at graduation, framed by a sober headline. Editorials urged calm and cooperation. By New Year's Day, snow had erased the last physical traces at the site. The case moved indoors into files and calendars. Detectives rechecked witness statements, mapping times with rulers and pencils. They considered opportunity windows between 7 and 9 p.m., narrowed by temperature drops and the lack of noise reports. Thanksgiving earlier that year was recalled by family as uneventful, a detail included in the file to establish routine. In January, investigators followed a lead involving a maintenance worker seen near the courthouse that night. His truck matched the general description. A search warrant produced nothing incriminating. Fibers did not match. The case stalled. Months passed. Spring thaw revealed nothing new. Emily Carter's name joined a list of unsolved cases kept in a filing cabinet near the captain's office. Each December, the town marked anniversaries quietly. Her parents attended services and placed flowers near the culvert, now just another dip in the road. Years later, advances in forensic science reopened possibilities. In the early 2000s, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation reviewed cold cases suitable for DNA testing. Emily's preserved swabs and fibers were located in cold storage, intact due to careful early handling. Technicians developed a partial profile from material unavailable to investigators in 1987. The profile entered national databases. Months passed without a hit. Then a familial match emerged tied to a man arrested for an unrelated burglary in Missouri. The connection was distant but promising. Investigators returned to Fairview with renewed purpose. They traced the family tree to a former farmhand named Robert Hale, who had lived outside town in 1987 and owned a light truck. Records showed he left Kansas shortly after Christmas that year. Employment logs placed him near County Road 12 on the evening in question. Interviews with former neighbors recalled his presence without detail. A warrant authorized a DNA sample. The match was confirmed with modern standards, linking Hale to the material collected decades earlier. The arrest occurred quietly in late November, days before Thanksgiving, closing a circle that had opened in winter. Hale was extradited, charged, and later convicted following a bench trial that focused on forensic linkage, opportunity, and behavior consistent with control rather than chaos. Sentencing acknowledged time passed and harm endured. Emily Carter's family attended, their faces steady. The town read the headline with disbelief and relief. The culvert froze again that December, unchanged, while a file was finally closed, and a name returned to the silence that had waited since 1987. The months following the initial discovery settled into a slow grind that defined cold cases in the late 1980s, when persistence meant paper and memory, rather than databases and alerts. Investigators revisited Emily Carter's routines with an almost ritual precision, reconstructing her days backward from the winter she disappeared. They reviewed class schedules from the community college, pharmacy delivery logs, and handwritten appointment books kept by local businesses. Each document was photocopied, annotated, and cross-referenced, building a picture that was ordinary by design. That ordinariness mattered, because deviations were the only signals left. December in Fairview carried traditions that shaped movement. Christmas pageants filled evenings, church potlucks extended nights, and farmers finished year-end repairs before snow hardened the ground. Emily's calendar showed no unusual commitments beyond work and family. Investigators expanded the geographic canvas beyond the culvert. They traced routes radiating from the courthouse square, measuring distances by odometer and stopwatch, driving them at night to replicate visibility and timing. County Road 12 curved past fields and drainage channels, its shoulders narrow and unforgiving. In winter, headlights caught reflectors and little else. The culvert where Emily was found lay at a bend that required slowing, a place locals navigated instinctively. This supported the theory that the person responsible knew the area well enough to stop without drawing attention. Patrol logs from that night were rechecked for traffic stops or calls. None aligned. Whether records were attached to the file, noting wind direction and snowfall intensity, factors that could explain the absence of witnesses. Witness interviews were repeated, sometimes years apart. People remembered fragments differently as time passed, their certainty softening. A farmer recalled hearing a truck idle late that night but could not place the date. A gas station attendant believed she saw Emily's car earlier than first reported, though receipts contradicted that memory. Investigators documented inconsistencies without judgment, understanding how seasonal stress and communal grief altered recall. Media attention waxed and waned, peaking around anniversaries. Each December, the local paper ran a brief remembrance, careful not to speculate. Missing person flyers faded from bulletin boards but remained in a binder at the station. Forensic limitations shaped strategy. The fibers collected in 1987 were examined under microscopes that offered comparison, not certainty. Analysts could say fibers were consistent with certain materials common in workwear, but not unique. Paint flecks from the culvert edge were cataloged, suggesting contact with a vehicle body, yet the formulation was widely used. Tire tread impressions, photographed and cast, indicated a pattern found on many light trucks sold regionally. The absence of a clear weapon or dramatic injury forced investigators to rely on process. Control and placement suggested intent without frenzy. This profile guided interviews toward individuals with access, time, and familiarity rather than transient threats. As years passed, personnel changes occurred. Retirements moved knowledge out the door. To counter this, the department created a narrative summary, a living document that condensed facts without interpretation. It listed names cleared and reasons why, routes examined, evidence stored, and unanswered questions. Emily Carter's case became a teaching file for new detectives, a reminder of thoroughness. Each new review added marginal notes but preserved the core. Thanksgiving of 1995 marked 8 years without resolution. Her parents continued to cooperate, providing photographs and answering questions again and again. The breakthrough required patience beyond the town. When the Kansas Bureau of Investigation initiated a cold case review, criteria favored cases with preserved biological material and clean chains of custody. Emily's file qualified because early investigators had sealed and labeled evidence carefully. The lab work was painstaking. Technicians extracted what they could from degraded samples, generating a partial genetic profile that met emerging standards. It was entered into national systems designed to flag potential relatives. This was not a solution, but a door left ajar. The first notification came quietly. A partial familial association suggested a distant relation to a man arrested in Missouri for a nonviolent property crime. Analysts cautioned against assumptions. Familial searching required building trees, confirming lineage, and eliminating false positives. Investigators requested records, tracing branches across counties and states. The process took months. Eventually, attention focused on Robert Hale, a name that appeared in Fairview employment logs from the mid-1980s. He had worked seasonal jobs, including maintenance near the courthouse. His address in 1987 placed him within minutes of County Road 12. Investigators reconstructed Hale's movements using payroll stubs, tax records, and testimony from former supervisors. He had left Kansas shortly after Christmas in 1987, moving first to Oklahoma, then Missouri. No prior violent record surfaced. Interviews with acquaintances described him as quiet, capable, and private. None provided an alibi for the night in question. Importantly, his truck ownership records matched the general profile noted decades earlier. This convergence warranted a lawful approach. Detectives sought a court order for a DNA sample, presenting probable cause grounded in forensic linkage and opportunity. The collection occurred under modern protocols. The comparison yielded a match that met statistical thresholds accepted by courts. Investigators revisited the original autopsy findings with contemporary experts, aligning them with the new evidence. The absence of extensive trauma was consistent with restraint by someone physically capable, familiar, and deliberate. Fibers previously deemed nonspecific were re-examined, now contextualized by Hale's work clothing from the era, similar in composition. The paint flecks matched a formulation used on his truck model. Each element alone was insufficient. Together they formed a coherent picture. The arrest was timed to minimize disruption. It took place in late November, as fields turned brown and holiday decorations reappeared. Fairview learned through a short press release that an arrest had been made in the Emily Carter case. The shock came from time, not spectacle. Residents recalibrated memories, recalling Hale as a passing presence. Legal proceedings unfolded with restraint. Pretrial motions addressed evidence admissibility, chain of custody, and the scope of familial DNA use. The court ruled within established law. At trial, the prosecution presented a narrative anchored in documents, science, and timelines. There was no need for dramatics. The defense challenged degradation and memory, as expected. The judge weighed credibility and probability. The verdict came without flourish. Hale was convicted and later sentenced according to statutes in place, with consideration of elapsed time and accountability. There were no public statements from the defendant beyond procedural filings. The aftermath in Fairview was subdued. Emily Carter's parents attended the sentencing, then returned home. The culvert remained a culvert, unmarked, as the family requested privacy. The case file was closed with a final entry noting resolution. Each December afterward, the town remembered differently with less uncertainty. The road still froze, the courthouse still lit its tree, and a long winter story finally reached its lawful end. As the legal process moved forward, investigators returned to the discipline that had sustained the case through decades of uncertainty, documenting every step with a precision shaped by past scrutiny. The pretrial phase required revisiting decisions made in 1987 and explaining them under contemporary standards. Chain of custody logs were reviewed page by page, initials verified, dates aligned. Evidence storage conditions were documented, noting temperature control and access protocols at the county facility, where boxes had rested through summers and winters. This attention mattered, because the strength of the case depended not on recollection, but on records that could withstand challenge. The methodical nature of the review reassured the court that the past had been handled with care, even when tools were limited. The reconstruction of December 1987 was refined again, this time with the benefit of corroborating data. Employment records showed Robert Hale finishing a shift near the courthouse in the early evening, a detail once mundane now central. Fuel receipts placed his truck in town that night. Witness statements that once seemed unhelpful gained context when layered with time stamps and distances. The investigators drove the route again, decades later, at the same hour, noting how Christmas lights along farmhouses could create alternating pools of visibility and shadow. Weather archives confirmed wind direction that would have carried engine noise away from nearby homes. These observations were not speculation, but environmental factors documented to explain why the act could occur unnoticed. Autopsy findings were presented with restraint, emphasizing what was known and what was not. The medical examiner testified through reports rather than dramatic assertion, noting indicators of restraint and timing without graphic detail. The absence of defensive injuries supported the theory of control, consistent with a familiar setting rather than a sudden public confrontation. The temperature data aligned with the estimated time of death, narrowing the window to hours when Hale had no documented obligations. The forensic linkage, particularly the DNA match, was explained statistically, with probabilities expressed conservatively. The court heard how the partial profile from 1987, once insufficient, became decisive when paired with modern analysis. The defense questioned degradation and coincidence, as expected, but the cumulative weight of evidence held. The judge considered the totality, not any single element. There were no claims of coerced confession or procedural shortcuts. The arrest had followed lawful warrants, the sample collection adhered to protocol, and the analysis met accepted standards. This clarity mattered to a community wary of spectacle. The verdict arrived without fanfare, delivered in a courtroom decorated modestly for the approaching holidays. Outside, the square prepared for its annual tree lighting, a contrast that underscored time's passage. Sentencing reflected both accountability and the reality of decades elapsed. The court acknowledged the enduring harm to Emily Carter's family and the community's long wait. Statements were submitted in writing, measured and composed. There was no attempt to rewrite history, only to close a chapter responsibly. The sentence aligned with statutes applicable to the offense, ensuring legality over symbolism. The defendant was remanded without incident. Local press reported the outcome in plain language, avoiding commentary. The headline emphasized resolution rather than drama. In the weeks that followed, Fairview adjusted quietly. Thanksgiving passed with familiar routines, families gathering in homes warmed by furnaces tested against the first hard freezes. Conversations acknowledged the news, then returned to everyday concerns. The pharmacy where Emily once worked had changed ownership twice, but a framed clipping remained in a back room, a reminder kept without display. The courthouse files were archived, labeled resolved, yet retained for historical record. Investigators updated the cold case index, removing Emily's name from the active list. The family's response was private. They requested no memorials at the site, preferring remembrance within their church and home. On Christmas Eve, candles were lit as always, this time with a different weight. Closure did not erase loss, but it altered its shape. The knowledge of what happened and who was responsible replaced speculation with fact. This mattered to a generation accustomed to order and accountability, values tested but not abandoned by time. For the investigators, the case reinforced lessons about patience and procedure. Early decisions to collect and preserve evidence, to document thoroughly, proved decisive decades later. The absence of sensational elements required a reliance on fundamentals, timelines, geography, records, and science. The case became a reference for training, illustrating how restraint and accuracy serve justice over the long arc. Younger officers learned that winter scenes demand particular care, that holidays complicate schedules, and that communities remember how cases are handled as much as how they end. As New Year approached, the town prepared for another cycle. Snow returned to County Road 12, filling the culvert with drifts that smoothed its edges. There was no marker there, only the road continuing past fields resting until spring. The story of Emily Carter entered local history as a solved case, cited without embellishment. The resolution did not bring celebration, only a quieter understanding. In the end, the work had been done as it should be, methodical and lawful, honoring both the victim and the process that finally spoke for her after so many winters. With the legal outcome settled, attention turned to documenting the case's long trajectory for institutional memory, an often overlooked phase that matters to communities shaped by time and continuity. Investigators compiled a final narrative summary, integrating original reports, later forensic developments, and court findings into a single chronological account. This document avoided interpretation, focusing instead on verified actions and dates. It described December conditions in 1987, the discovery, early investigative steps, and the gradual evolution toward resolution. Copies were filed at the county sheriff's office and with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, ensuring that the work would not fade into fragmented recollection. The preservation of records became a subject of reflection. Boxes once stored in a basement room with controlled access were inventoried again, now destined for long-term archives. Evidence that had driven the conviction remained secured according to court order, while ancillary materials were digitized. This transition from paper to electronic form mirrored broader changes in policing over the intervening decades. Yet the substance of the work remained familiar to older officers: careful notes, corroborated timelines, and respect for limitations. The case demonstrated that technology amplifies diligence but cannot replace it. Fairview's sense of place framed the aftermath. The town's rhythms continued, shaped by agriculture and seasons. Winter roads still demanded caution, and holiday schedules still compressed daily routines. Residents remembered where they were when the news broke in 1987, and where they were when the arrest was announced decades later. The distance between those moments measured not just years but shifts in perspective. Younger residents learned the story from parents and grandparents, absorbing it as local history rather than immediate fear. For them, the resolution affirmed that time does not erase accountability. The courthouse square remained the symbolic center. Its records room held the original docket entries, now marked complete. Clerks who had once filed missing person notices retired, replaced by successors trained on digital systems. Yet the same wooden counters and fluorescent lights persisted. Each December, decorations appeared, and each December, staff remembered the case as part of the town's shared experience. This continuity mattered to an older audience, attuned to institutional memory and the steady presence of civic spaces. Media retrospectives were limited and factual. A regional paper published a long-form account emphasizing procedure over personality. It traced the investigation's phases and highlighted the importance of evidence preservation. There were no interviews seeking emotional reaction. The tone matched the community's preference for restraint. Letters to the editor expressed gratitude for closure and respect for the family's privacy. This approach reflected an understanding that justice does not require spectacle to be meaningful. For the Carter family, the years following resolution were defined by adjustment rather than celebration. They settled into routines without the burden of uncertainty. Legal closure allowed administrative tasks long deferred, such as updating records and finalizing memorial plans within the family. They continued to mark holidays with intention, acknowledging loss while embracing continuity. Their experience underscored a truth familiar to those who have lived through long chapters. Resolution changes grief, but does not remove it. From a procedural standpoint, the case influenced policy. The sheriff's office updated evidence handling protocols, reinforcing standards already in place. Training sessions referenced the importance of winter scene management and early documentation of environmental conditions. The use of familial DNA searching prompted discussions about ethics and scope, ensuring that future applications remained bounded by law and oversight. These changes were incremental, grounded in practice rather than reaction. The broader lesson resonated with an audience shaped by decades of public service narratives. The case illustrated how patience and fidelity to process can bridge generations. It challenged assumptions that unsolved cases remain static, showing instead that they evolve as tools and context change. Yet it also warned against complacency, emphasizing that early care determines future possibilities. This balance between tradition and adaptation spoke to men who had witnessed transitions in work, technology, and civic life. As another winter passed, the physical landscape offered its own commentary. Snow softened edges and thaw revealed familiar lines. County Road 12 remained unremarkable to passers-by, its significance known only to those who remembered. The culvert continued to serve its purpose, carrying water beneath the road during spring rains. There was no plaque, no marker, only the knowledge held by a few. This absence aligned with the family's wishes and the community's temperament. In quiet moments, investigators reflected on the case as part of their career's arc. Some had joined after 1987, inheriting the file. Others had retired before resolution. Those still serving recognized the privilege of seeing a case conclude properly. They understood that many do not. This awareness reinforced humility and commitment to the next file, the next winter scene, the next set of questions awaiting careful answers. The story of Emily Carter settled into the town's narrative as a reminder of vulnerability and responsibility. It affirmed that even in small places, harm can occur unseen, and that the response must be steady and lawful. The resolution did not rewrite the past but clarified it. For a generation accustomed to measuring progress by tangible outcomes, that clarity mattered. As the calendar turned again, Fairview prepared for another year. The courthouse clock marked time as it always had. Files rested in order. Roads froze and thawed. And a case that began in the cold of December 1987 stood resolved, its lessons preserved in records and memory, ready to guide those who would carry the work forward. In the years after the conviction, the Emily Carter case continued to influence how Fairview understood justice, not as an abstract idea, but as a process grounded in patience and restraint. Older residents spoke about it less frequently, yet when it surfaced, the conversation carried a tone of sober reflection rather than curiosity. The knowledge that the truth had eventually emerged allowed memories to settle into place without speculation. For many, especially those who had followed the case since 1987, the resolution affirmed a belief that careful work, even when slow, still matters. Law enforcement agencies beyond the county took note. The case was cited in professional bulletins as an example of successful cold case resolution rooted in early evidence preservation. Training materials emphasized how decisions made during the first hours of an investigation can echo decades later. Photographs taken in winter light, notes written by hand, and envelopes sealed with care became teaching points. The message was clear. Diligence is not obsolete, even as tools change. The courthouse archives now hold the complete record, indexed and digitized, accessible for lawful review. The file shows the evolution of investigative standards across generations, from manual typewriters to forensic databases. Yet the essential structure remains consistent: observation, documentation, verification. This continuity resonates with an audience that values systems built to endure. The case did not rely on sudden insight or extraordinary luck, but on the accumulation of reliable facts assembled over time. For Fairview, the passage of seasons continues to frame memory. Thanksgiving gatherings still bring families together under familiar routines. Christmas Eve services still end with candles raised in quiet unison. New Year's arrives with the same courthouse bell marking midnight. Within these rituals, the absence left by Emily Carter is acknowledged without display. Her name is spoken within families who remember her as a neighbor's daughter, a coworker, a familiar face. The resolution allowed those memories to remain personal, rather than suspended in uncertainty. The suspect's removal from the community decades earlier had gone unnoticed, which in hindsight underscored the difficulty of the original investigation. He had not been a prominent figure, only a presence passing through routine spaces. This reality reinforced a lesson about familiarity and anonymity in small towns. It reminded residents that harm does not always announce itself loudly, and that vigilance depends on systems rather than assumptions. From a legal standpoint, the case reinforced confidence in lawful process. The conviction rested on evidence tested and retested, not on confession or conjecture. Appeals were considered and denied within established frameworks. There were no reversals, no lingering questions about procedure. This outcome mattered to a generation shaped by respect for institutions, affirming that justice achieved slowly but correctly is preferable to speed without certainty. The Carter family's privacy was maintained throughout. They declined interviews and public statements, choosing to let the record speak. Their restraint influenced the community's response, setting a tone that balanced acknowledgement with respect. In time, they relocated from Fairview, carrying with them both loss and resolution. Their departure was quiet, consistent with how they had endured the long years before answers arrived. As newer cases emerged elsewhere, Emily Carter's name receded from headlines but not from institutional memory. The sheriff's office maintained a brief annual review of resolved cold cases, ensuring that lessons remained active. Officers nearing retirement spoke of the satisfaction in seeing one case completed fully, a rare closure in a profession often defined by open ends. Younger officers listened, understanding that such outcomes are earned, not expected. The physical landscape offered no commentary. County Road 12 remains a route used by farmers and delivery trucks, its culvert performing the same function year after year. Snow still gathers there in winter, meltwater still runs through in spring. There is nothing to distinguish it from countless other roadside features across Kansas. This ordinariness aligns with the community's preference to remember without spectacle. In reflecting on the full arc of the case, what stands out is not a single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of small, correct actions. A deputy photographing a scene despite the cold. A clerk filing reports carefully. An evidence technician labeling samples with clarity. Decades later, a lab analyst applying new methods to old material. Each step mattered. Each step honored the responsibility entrusted to the system. For the audience shaped by long careers, service, and routine, this story carries a familiar weight. It speaks to endurance, to work done without expectation of recognition, and to the belief that order can be restored even after long disruption. The Kansas 1987 case resolved not with triumph, but with quiet completion. As time moves forward, Fairview continues as it always has, attentive to seasons and schedules. The case of Emily Carter now belongs to history, documented, resolved, and understood. It remains a reminder that even when answers take decades, they can still arrive through lawful means, and that patience, when paired with integrity, remains one of justice's most reliable tools.